Okay, here we go. That's off. I'm gonna turn that. Okay, all the intros are off. We're good. All right. Welcome, Randall. I'm so excited to have you on here.
What's going on? Thank you for having me.
Man, yeah. I seriously, I raced in the door, set up the Zoom, all in like the last 5 minutes. My brain is kind of scattered at the moment.
I know how it is, man. I know how it is. I live on the edge constantly.
Yes. So thank you so much for being here. I'm sure we'll have tons of questions. There's already tons of questions in here because I set this up at like 3:00 today. So there's just too many. I got things going back to 3:50 p.m.
That's good. I'm glad people are interested.
Yeah. So your big work was that everyone seems to know you for is working on the ISDA Phase 6, sort of letting everyone know that the requirement for this collateral that would be needed for institutions and banks, anyone else that does $50 billion in derivatives or more or above is going to go up. And it's going to make doing a lot of these swaps that they've been sort of stringing along their liabilities with a lot harder to do.
100%. I think the big thing is to understand, like, when we talk about like ISDA and Phase 6 and swaps. I mean, there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of moving parts that go into all of that, right? And so you have a big game of a bunch of professionals that are playing this. And at the end of the day, it's when I started researching this, it was very hard, and that's kind of why I teamed up with Bigham's, because I'm like, hey, this seems like I need somebody else to help me tackle this, right? Because there's just so much information that's there. And so it was great. We were able to find a lot of different things, and the knowledge has adapted over time as well. Like what we thought was the case maybe, in 2021 when we first figured this out compared to what it's like now. It's just way different. And like I was telling you before we started on the call, like Phase 6 with the banking, it's a combination of a lot of things, but I kind of just honed down into Phase 6. So I'm happy to discuss that and even talk about some of the intricacies that maybe other people haven't seen or hasn't been explained. So
we got time. Let's explore it all.
Great.
Give sort of like the quick nitty gritty on the Phase 6 first, so that people can kind of get their brains associated with where we're going to go from there.
Absolutely. So Phase 6 is the final phase, right? So there was 5 phases before this. The reason why Phase 6 is so much different is because the amount of entities that came into scope now was like a 70% increase, right? So you've already have a lot of these big banks. We're probably the first ones, like a lot of the big banks that we don't like when we see in our when we talk about AMC and GameStop and that type of stuff. Those banks that we give a lot of the attention to, probably, and I'll be honest, probably not as affected by Phase 6 directly. Right. It's going to be the smaller guys that are falling into scope that maybe manage smaller portfolios, smaller banks, things like that. But the idea is, and the way I've always looked at this is, it's like a topple down. It's from the bottom to the top effect, right? These guys start having stress down here, they're going to feel it at the top.
Well, yeah, because the little guys get their margin from the big guys,
right? So, that's exactly what it is. And so, so there's like another, and we'll get into this. There's like a whole technical aspect too. So like, let's just put like the market aside. Just the collateral management process is like very taxing, and it's still done like in a lot of cases manually, right? And when you have somebody that's manually managing this, and it's having to connect, and a lot of people are like on tri-party systems. It means they're working with like 3 middlemen. When you have that sort of where you have somebody manually posting to that, it just leaves room for errors. That's how shit like reporting numbers and the things that we kind of see, that's how that happens. But really what it is, and this is for uncleared margin rules, right? Phase 6. And so we're going to get into the differences between cleared and uncleared, right?
Okay.
But Phase 6 is specifically for uncleared trades, right? OTC derivative trades. So like you said, we're talking about swaps, all kinds of different swaps. Specifically, the one that I've kind of honed in on is like total return swaps. But they have interest rate swaps, fixed floating rates, inflation rate swaps. I mean, they really
there's probably 50 of them I don't even know about.
Right. No, and same here. And the thing is, and that's kind of like, I guess, the core of this argument when it comes to like ISDA, is a lot of this is bilateral, meaning and a lot of this stuff doesn't hit like normal regulation, right? So it's like you and I working out a deal, and as long as me and you are seeing eye to eye on what we have an understanding of what this deal is going to be and what we expect, there's not going to be a whole lot of like other hands grabbing at it, like wanting to know what's going on or checking at it.
It basically would be like, oh, I've got these liabilities for these loans I have, and I'm going to trade them for the liabilities you have on stocks that you sold, and we're just gonna hold them for a couple of years.
Right. And the thing is, too, I'm not going to do any vetting on what else you've done with those liabilities either. Yeah. So like, I'm just taking your word for it. And I think that's kind of, it's what it is a lot of, and this is why another part of Phase 6, like we're opening up a big rabbit hole right now. But another thing is like, you got to understand a lot of these bigger banks, they swallow smaller banks. And what I mean by that is they can out lawyer them. They can out language them. So they'll write ISDA contracts to smaller banks that are literally designed to screw over the smaller banks if shit hits the fan, right? Yeah. I mean, like waiving rights to litigation, like all kinds of different stuff. Yeah. And so these big banks take advantage of the language in these contracts, and because there's no real oversight over it and nobody's really paying attention, it's very hard to kind of get a real clear gauge of what's going on. But anyways, so we're talking about Phase 6, and I'm kind of getting off topic here. Yeah. But uncleared margin rules pay for OTC over the counter derivatives. And basically they decrease the notional amount. So how you talked about that 50 billion, it was much higher. Yeah. So that's why when we talk about a lot of firms coming into scope, they were under that threshold, right? They were under that threshold. So now that threshold has been much lowered, all these firms come into scope. And under the new rules right now, they're subject to margin requirements. And again, depending how over leveraged these people are, I mean, it causes some real problems. Yeah. And when you have margin requirements that are imposed on you, you need collateral. And that leads us kind of into the next thing is they want high quality, like liquid assets. Yeah. They're not going to just take bullshit, right? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. They want like treasury bonds, government bonds, stuff that's cross border bonds, like stuff that's maybe insured by two different government systems. Yeah. And the thing is banks right now, because of the banking crisis and shit, they're holding on to that, dude. They don't want to give out that collateral. Nobody does really. And so that's the problem. So the key issue of Phase 6, right, that it proposes for these smaller firms, the bottom line is it's collateral issues, collateral requirements. Yeah. And there's a higher demand now to get their hands on that collateral. So, Phase 1, I think was $1 trillion. We do $1 trillion in derivatives trades. 1.3 actually. Yeah. So that's like Bank of America, JP Morgan, and that's about it. Maybe like UBS, a couple of them might be up there. Right. But those guys, they don't take on margin necessarily. They do, the fractional deposits and stuff. That's how they kind of spread out their value. But they're not the ones necessarily borrowing, except they're borrowed from their central banks. Right. So when you get down to these funds, firms, institutions, and banks that are at the $50 billion level of derivatives trades, you are now in family funds, hedge funds, smaller nation sovereign wealth funds, pension funds. A lot of these groups that were getting away with the last couple of years with such what they're called toxic assets, where when they do repo, they're supposed to be doing repo with like their government treasury bonds, but they're doing it with like, junk bonds and like crappy dollar stocks and stuff. And that's the problem is like, I just feel like, I have a hard time believing, and I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, right? Nothing surprises me, but I just have a hard time being that there's such liquidity strain on the banks right now that they're paying a much closer eye to what people are posting. And that's why I'm saying it's like right now it's like a mad dash for collateral. That's what it is, for high quality collateral, right? And when you have a bunch of people that are all seeking the same thing, that creates liquidity challenges, right? These institutions, they start scrambling because everybody's trying to source sufficient collateral. So people are running, and the thing is like when we talk about like Archegos and Bill Huang, if Phase 6 existed during this time, that would have never happened. Yeah, like that whole issue, they would have seen it coming from a mile away, and some people probably did, but
what wasn't Bill Huang even below that? Because he was at like 30 billion.
Yeah, but so here's the thing. When we talk about like these smaller firms and stuff, you got to remember that they might be working because it's from the top down. So even whoever I'm working with, let's say I'm engaging in swap transactions, right? If I'm working with a party that's, for example, facilitating this trade, they also are subject to phase 6. So sometimes you can get grandfathered in, even though you're not even trying to be there, right?
Just because you're doing a deal with someone who is,
right. Because and now all of a sudden you're subject to the same requirements. So I just feel like that had these would have been in play, none of this. I shouldn't say, just maybe wouldn't have been to the magnitude that it was.
Like if people aren't quite familiar with Archegos, we talked about him a lot, but like Bill Huang was using the same $800 million collateral with 5 different investment banks and taking out as much as he possibly could from each one. And then when it went sour, they went, oh shit, he doesn't have enough collateral. So can't take care of anything.
He was taking all those total return swaps and everything, and he was basically presenting that he had a bunch of exposure and stuff that he just didn't have, and people were just taking it, taking it for face value. So that's the biggest thing is, okay, look, you're at a certain number. Now that if you're doing way around, if you're doing swap business or business in the derivative market, you're going to be subject to these collateral requirements. And in the spirit of being transparent here, I can tell you what I would do if I was in these banks. How I would try and get around it was I would try and spread my funds across multiple different broker dealers, basically, to stay. So try and keep this one at 25 billion, this one at 25 billion, this one at 25 billion. But the thing is again, how I post and report collateral to party X and Y could be completely different than how I report it to party Z. Right. So again, it's just, and you have somebody that's manually doing this. It just comes to fucking major issues. So we were talking about high quality collateral. I mean, we can touch a little bit more on that. Most of that is going to be like what you said, government bonds, sovereign debt issued by stable. And then I have to say stable credit worthy governments, right?
Not Lebanon. Not Sri Lanka.
That's not going to be, a lot of people think that we're that corrupt, and there is, I mean, the government is that corrupt, but again, they're trying to protect, money at the end of the day. So they're not going to take on bullshit. Right.
And at the end of the day, we can also just print, and other nations don't necessarily have that ability.
So you have, supranational bonds, which is like debt securities by supranational organizations like European Investment Bank. Those are going to be your big banks, like the World Banks, things like that. So they'll take that. They're going to take agency bonds, right? Bonds issued by government-sponsored enterprises, agencies, things like that. And then obviously high-rated corporate bonds. Those are something that they'll take. Right. But all of this, again, is because you have everybody that's needing these now. There ain't enough to go around. Cash is one thing they'll take. Right. And they'll take cash. And then central bank reserves. That's like another. It really goes. It's a large list, but all this stuff is like it's not easy to get your hands on this. And the last one would be gold. Right. And precious metals. So any of those, that's going to give you collateral that they'll accept. But again, how easy that is to get, especially on larger scales when you have multiple people having to go and do it. It's a big thing. And with phase 6 too, I want to explain, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a delay. It was supposed to actually be the September. So it happened last year of 2022, but it was supposed to be 2021, but they got a year.
COVID kind of delayed everything.
It stopped it kind of in its tracks. But that's the first part about it, right? That's like a good understanding where I feel like people should understand what we just said. If there's questions, we can go over those. And if not, we can go on to the next section.
Yeah.